I'm going to show you this trick while we paint these beautiful muted watercolor fall leaves, but this trick will blow your mind. I love it. I use it all the time. Today I'll be using my limited palette that has Cad Yellow, Quin Magenta, Cerulean, Indigo, and Sap Green. I love mixing all of those colors together to get beautiful muted fall colors. I'm also going to be using some round brushes. You can use any round brush that you want. I'm using Bao Hong cold press watercolor paper, water, a rag, and an HB pencil. My favorite watercolor trick will be revealed as we paint these leaves, but let's first sketch some ideas. I'm from the valley in Arizona. It's very hot. We don't really have fall leaves, but I have seen fall leaves because in northern Arizona, beautiful, beautiful fall leaves. Not a whole lot of variation, so I did look up a lot of reference pictures to get an idea of what these fall leaves look like. So if you have a personal in-person reference, I would use that. Otherwise, you can look up some pictures of different fall leaves. My tip for sketching out fall leaves that are symmetrical is sketch it piece by piece on each side. So you can see as I'm following this leaf, I'm making sure that each side is very similar, but it's also following the curve of the stem that I created first. In my loose watercolor style, I don't typically sketch before I paint, but when I'm painting something that's so symmetrical, I will mess it up. I will have one side bigger than the other, so I like to sketch a guide for myself so I don't go completely out of bounds. That first one was so complicated, I needed a very simple one. So one of the ways I like to draw these leaves is I draw a basic, very circular leaf, and then I add the texture to it. So you can start with a really light sketch for your basic leaf shape, and then here I'm going and adding more of the jagged, textured edge of the leaf. I also want you to remember that reference pictures are just for reference, and you can do whatever you want. You can make up your own type of leaf, you can have a big chunk out of the leaf, dead spots on your leaf. Just have fun with it. We are artists. We can do what we want. I have no idea what kind of tree this leaf comes from, but I loved the idea when I saw a picture of this leaf of these uneven, rounded edges. And it was fun because I didn't have to make it too symmetrical, but I wanted it to be the idea of symmetry just a little bit, so I did do kind of each side bouncing back and forth together so that they looked similar enough, but I didn't have to worry about perfect equal sides. I would also say that for all of the sketching that I'm doing, the outlines, the veins, the stem, if I was doing this at home like you, I would be doing a lot lighter of a sketch. I'm pressing down really hard and making the sketch a lot darker so that you can see it here on the video. But watercolor is a layering, transparent medium, and so you can see the pencil sketch underneath. So I would do your sketches as light as you possibly can. Maybe start dark if you're feeling intimidated by losing some of the shapes so you won't be able to see it. And then you can work on getting lighter and lighter and see how well you can go from there. I loved the look of this leaf in the reference pictures, but it was kind of tricky for me to draw, and I left in some of my need to erase things as I went because I just wanted to show you that it is hard for me to sketch things too. Sometimes it's easier for me to create rounded shapes with a brush that I can tell it exactly what to do. This leaf has a bunch of really rounded points. So each of the rounded points looks almost like a typical leaf, but then it's all connected together in the middle. And I just really struggled with some of the roundness of it. But I didn't want to get rid of the leaf altogether. I thought it was, anyway, such a cool leaf. So that to say, another reason why you can sketch light so that you don't totally leave these dark marks on your paper, and you can go back and erase and redraw and sketch and finagle and move it around. But also keep in mind that if you're not drawing as hard as I am, that you can paint over your sketches. So even if my lines are not perfect or as rounded as I wanted them to be, I can go and use watercolor later to make it just a little bit more round, a little bit more perfect. And we're going to do a smaller leaf that has a really cool teardrop shape down here on the bottom. And I kept this one really simple. We're going to do nice, smooth, clean lines, and then just a few veins. One of the ways to add a lot of dynamic movement to a subject like a leaf that is so stagnant is to draw your center stem at a curve. So in a lot of these sketches, I'm drawing that center stem first to get an idea of the placement, positioning, and also the curvature of the entire leaf. And then I'm going to add the texture and the sides to the leaf. And for this one, I was looking at a reference picture, but I kind of thought, let's just go crazy. It's a little bit symmetrical, but a little bit more jagged and fun, just a little bit more free. And those are our sketched out leaves for our painting today. And let's get to the fun part, the actual painting. That's what you're here for, not to see me sketch leaves all day long. Now this first leaf, we are going to start with just plain water. Don't worry, this is not the watercolor trick that saved my life or whatever, but we are about to get to it. So first, plain clean water. We are just going to fill the entire area of our sketch with this clean water. Now I am looking at a reference picture, so the colors I'm using are yellow, orange, and green to give this leaf a lot of dynamic color differences, kind of like a leaf that was green but is slowly changing to a very burnt red color. So while it's still very wet, I'm dropping in a lot of yellow because the main color of this leaf is yellow. We're going to fill as much of the center with yellow as possible, and then we're going to drop in the orange and the green to kind of bleed and blend into the yellow. Now I'm using sap green to add the green at the bottom of the leaf and at the stem and the veins of the leaf. So everything that's towards the bottom as it's still trying to maintain the green, and then everything on the tips and the edges is what will become kind of our orange color. Now I don't have orange on my limited palette, but yellow in a higher concentration plus some magenta gives us a nice, beautiful orange color. And I am just going to focus that color right on the tips and then use a damp brush to kind of bleed and blend that into the yellow color. Okay, it's almost time for my favorite watercolor trick. First, we are going to paint very strong magenta color right at the stem, so it's kind of bleed into the leaf where it turns green. And then here's the trick, drum roll, we are using the other end of our brush to pull the color from that stem and make a mark by pushing into the paper just a little bit. And we are dragging that through on top of the lines that we had already marked in our sketch into the leaf. Now, why is this my favorite trick? And why would we do this over just painting the little veins and the stems in the leaf? Well, if you can get some dark concentrated color to drag across the leaf without having to paint it, it is so organic and thin and natural looking. Sometimes when we paint lines, it can be thicker in one spot, thinner in another spot. We're not always very consistent with the stroke as far as, you know, maybe being a little bit wavy. But something about pushing into the paper and dragging a line is very focused, is very neat and tidy, and it gives us these beautiful organic veins in the leaf. And this one, it might not be as impressive because the colors are a little bit lighter, but the next leaf, we're going to do it in all the leaves. The next leaf, I promise it will really wow you. You'll be able to see why this is my favorite watercolor technique. You probably already know this technique. It's not a mystery or a secret. It's definitely not something I came up with, so nobody in my comments tell me that. I'm trying to take credit for it. It is just one of those techniques that once you know it, it feels absolutely life-changing. There are so many different applications for it, and we'll talk about some of those later as well. All right, so let's do it again. Let's paint another leaf and I will show you the trick. when it is time. We're going to start with a very pinky red base. This is a mixture of the cad yellow and the quin magenta together, and we're filling the entire shape of the sketch with this beautiful pinky red color. Remember that with watercolor, we start with our lightest values of color. So I am starting with this lighter pink color, but while it's still wet, we get to add in whatever color we want, especially to make it look more fall themed. So I did add a little bit of yellow to the center to bring some of the brightness back in, but one of my favorite tricks is adding a tiny bit of sap green to magenta. You get this beautiful purpley magenta, maroon, almost brown color, and I just thought this was the perfect contrast for this leaf. Isn't that color combination incredible? But this is also a perfect color for this trick, this watercolor trick. So now that we've got that really dark color, we can do the trick. So what happens when we are pushing down on the other end of our brush and we're creating essentially a dent in the paper is the pigment is flowing into the dent and it becomes darker. So especially if we are using a darker contrasting color, we can drag some of that color around and that color will flow into the impression that we're making on the paper, leaving this perfectly straight, perfectly thin vein, but it is colored with watercolor and we didn't even have to paint it. I love, love, love this trick. I think the reason I love it so much is I have a really hard time with fine lines. And when I paint fine lines, I want them to be organic and free-flowing, but I always make them way too thick. And it's just such a great way to avoid that. So for this leaf, from my reference picture, it was bright green, but then the tips were a brownish magenta color. So perfect, because green and magenta are opposites on the color wheel. When they combine, they are going to make those naturally muted fall colors. So I painted the whole thing green, kept it in a little bit of a lighter value, and then I took that magenta brown mixture that we had before where we added some of the sap green and I added that to the tips. Then at the end of adding all of that, I add a even brighter, more concentrated color of magenta right to the very, very tips, just to bump up the contrast and the difference between the colors even more. If the colors don't bleed and blend down into each other as much as you want them to, you can always rinse your brush, tap it on your paper towel or your rag, make sure that it's damp and not wet, and you can kind of move that color around with a damp brush. So here I'm adding a magenta stem. I just think a magenta stem is really nice. It makes really nice contrast for any of the leaves that you're doing. And then I add that same magenta to the tips of each of these leaves. Because the magenta is so strong, when we drag from the tip of the leaf to the stem using my favorite watercolor technique, we are going to get a lot of bold color that kind of drags along with us as we make the mark in the paper. So there's a couple of different ways you could do it. I could have dragged color from the stem towards the bottom of the leaf up into the tips of each of the leafy sections, and then the green would have flowed more into the impression in the paper. But it wouldn't have been as much of a contrast. So I decided to play around with it and start from the tip of the leafy section down to the stem, and I really liked how that looked for that leaf. Now we're going to paint this leaf here on the upper left. I kept the colors really simple, kind of along that classic fall leaf look, yellows, oranges, reds, and remember that you're dropping the paint into more paint while everything is still very wet. If you live in a pretty dry place, you might have to move a lot quicker because the paper will get a lot less wet. It will get more damp to dry, and you won't have a lot of that easy blending that gives it that fall leaf look as everything's changing so gradually between the colors. For this leaf, again, I'm going to use a dark magenta color and tap that into the leaf to create the stem, and then I'm going to drag that color up into the leaf by pushing down. So it's kind of nice because we get a lot of darkness towards the base of the stem where I feel like there would be darkness, and it gets a little bit lighter and more subtle as we get to the edges of the leaf. Another thing to remember is that watercolor dries a lot lighter than it looks when you're painting with it. So feel free to add as bold of colors as you want, especially in those areas of darker high contrast that you're wanting to paint, because they will dry a lot lighter than you think they will. For this leaf on the lower right, it's very simple, but the shape is very interesting, so I wanted the colors also to be quite interesting. I got this beautiful purple by mixing a bunch of colors together on my palette, and then I added some deep greens and even a little bit of indigo to give it a nice contrast and some unique colors. Now I'm about to use my favorite watercolor trick on this one. Here's the indigo. I'm going to add that, and then quickly I'm going to turn the other end of my brush. But watch how I do this one. I start from the top, I drag through the leaf, and I actually create the stem by dragging the color out of the leaf. So that's another way you can do this trick that's a little bit different than how we've done it before. Then I add the other veins in the leaf before it's dry, and we move on to the next leaf. I think the shape of this final leaf is actually my favorite, but I felt like we needed to do a very brown leaf. So I'm using color theory, mixing together all the colors on my palette until I get brown. I did want my brown to lean a little bit more warm, so it's a little bit heavier on the yellow. But the way that I color mix is I'm using magenta, cerulean, and yellow. And if I notice it's a little bit too purple, I will add yellow, which is the opposite on the wheel, to neutralize the purple, but then I can add more yellow to give it a more yellow base, a yellow tone. And then I went through and added a few different colors that I thought went well with this beautiful brown, like the deep green, a little bit of a deeper magenta, just mixing colors together until I felt like the contrast was right. Then I rinsed off my brush, and with a damp brush, I'm going to pick up a few areas for highlight. And I did this because I felt like it was a very dark color, but I loved the lightness of that reddish pink one we have over to the right, and I achieved that by leaving some areas light. So if you feel like you lose your highlight, always feel free to go back, use a damp brush to swipe some of that paint off before it dries. So I know in this video I'm showing you my favorite watercolor technique, putting these dents in the paper that give you these beautiful perfect stems and veins in watercolor fall leaves, but there are so many applications for this technique. You could do details on a house, you could do tree trunks, branches, stems, rocks, anything in your watercolor paintings where you need a little bit of texture, but it's almost too hard to paint some of those thin lines, and you want just the color you have on your paper to seep into that groove, is the perfect time to use this technique. Just make sure to use it when your paper is still wet and use it sparingly. It will look perfect. Then I decided to paint a very simple shadow because I thought the leaves looked a little bit flat. But thank you so much for being here with me today while I painted the fall leaves using my absolute favorite watercolor trick. It is something that I use all the time, and I hope you find more applications for use in your own watercolor paintings.